It's 6 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. I jumped up here early. We had a speaker the other night. He just completely started without me, so make sure it's a little job security. I'll get up here and talk. I'd like to tell you about a couple of the lectures we have coming up on February 5th. We have John Lilly, who is the editor of Golden Seal, and he's going to talk about Golden Seal and country music in West Virginia. He's going to go find a couple of the things that he truly loves. On March 5th, we're going to have Dr. Billy Joe Payton. He should be finishing up a book on the history of Charleston, so he'll come and share some of that with us. On April 2nd, we're going to have Dr. Charles Ledbetter. He's going to be talking about the West Virginia State College Aviation Program, Tuskegee Airmen Connection and the Experiment. Not a lot of people know this, but a lot of the pilots that were later known as Tuskegee Airmen actually were trained and were West Virginians. They went to school there at West Virginia State, and then they joined the Experiment. On May 7th, we're going to have Russ Barber. He's going to be talking about one of the more interesting governors of West Virginia, William C. Marlin. Governor Marlin did a couple of very interesting things. West Virginia was one of the very first states to integrate its school system, and he was governor then. He's also the governor who came up with the coal severance tax, which has helped us in these lean economic times where West Virginia has a budget surplus and everybody else is dealing with deficits. But he also, many of you I see are smiling because he was the governor they found driving a taxi cab a few years later. So he's a real interesting character, and I think should make for a good talk. And that's going to be Russ Barber and Dick Faust back there on the camera. He's going to be helping out with that as well. But our speaker tonight is Randy Marcum. He is our newest addition here at the Archives. He started, it was about a year and a half ago at the Records Management and Preservation Board. He's been going out for that time actually in county courthouses. So he's been to quite a few courthouses and seen quite a few of their records. And now he's actually a historian here in our library. So he's well knowledgeable in this area. So without further ado, Randy Marcum.
I want to make sure I have everything laid out here on the table because it's kind of a little showcase, a mini showcase to a certain extent for later on in the evening here. I've got it broken down into several different areas that I was going to talk about tonight. The first one, okay, with the death records, of course a lot of this stuff is online as far as the births, the marriages, and the death records. All of us eventually, I guess, will get a death certificate, and this will kind of give you an overview of what they looked like way back when. Some of the examples that I do have laid out will be from probably about the teens and 20s. Do we have any undertakers or embalmers here tonight? Just kind of wondering, because if there was, I was going to ask them some of the specifics on how they do it nowadays. But as I mentioned, a lot of this is online, so I'll go ahead and... Are many of you aware of our website, the westvirginiaculture.org? And then the archives portion, you can go to the what I'll do is I'll step you through the ones that hasn't used our website. I'll step you through this, and that way when you go home and when you're doing some of this research, you can. Okay, I'm going to go down to where the databases are listed. And you notice that I clicked on one of the databases that carries the birth, death, and marriages. I'm going to click on the death. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in a name here. Okay, last name, Hatfield. First name is Sidney. Oops. certificate out. Okay, when you enter the name, notice I entered the last name and then the first name. You can be pretty specific on these, but you may have to go around the name. There may be some other spellings and things up to get to that actual name. And I know this one will probably pop up with the first two. And we're getting right to his death certificate. Okay, the death certificates, kind of got this in a little bit different order than what it originally would have been, but the death certificates are something that came about in 1917. Before that, the counties had death record books. And those books are started about 1853. The government of Virginia said that they directed the counties that they need to go ahead and start keeping these records, the death records of the citizens. So 1853, they started keeping actually, let me go back to this one. Get down to where Sid Hatfield's death certificate. Okay, each county kept death record books. From about 1853 on, the state of Virginia said, start keeping these records for the state, so that we can keep track as far as the deaths and things like that. 1853, they started keeping track pretty well on a lot of it. There is some blanks here and there. There's some of the books have been destroyed, of course, from fires and things. Lincoln County pops to mind. 1909, their courthouse damaged in a fire, and practically a lot of the records were practically destroyed. Webster County, about 1888, their courthouse was destroyed in a fire. So some of these records for these counties are probably not going to exist, or if they do, they're going to be through where people have rebuilt them using census records and things like that. About 1853, they started keeping these records, and that continues on up even into the present day. The counties still keep track of these. In a book that's similar to this, as far as the ledgers, they go ahead and type all the information, the person's name, which will, as we go across through here, you'll see that, of course, there was where they died at, a little bit of personal information about that person, their age and things, what they did. Then going on over, a little bit of the family information, where their family was from, their father and their mother. Then you get on over into some of it. And of course, we scrolled all the way across the thing. And this is Sidney Hatfield's, this is the last portion of his entry into the county record. Go on over. Not a whole lot of information. Of course, you see the doctor there, Harry Green Camper. He was the doctor down in McDowell County. There's not a whole lot of information in the county record part of it, in the ledger book, but now the death certificate contains just a little bit more information. Like with Sid Hatfield here, it tells you as far as how he died and things like that, and some of the other information that would be of interest to a genealogist when they're studying these records. Now, that gives you an idea as far as the county record part of it goes. And most counties are going to have this form. It's going to be most likely a ledger book, and it's most likely going to have pretty much that same information on the person.
In Sid Hatfield's case, would he be recorded in the McDowell County book where he died? Or
Yes.
the Mingo County book?
Yes, he's in the McDowell County book. This is the, sorry about that, this is the McDowell County book, the death record book. Now, this record here was used also to formulate the death certificate for Sid Hatfield, which that was what I went to first off there. Now, I'll go back and mention a few things as far as the 1853 date that the counties were the state of Virginia, and then later on when the state of West Virginia came about in 1863, they continued on with this. But the ledger books like this, not all, for 1853, the death records of people, they don't really exist. Unfortunately, the counties, a lot of them didn't keep track of it. But there is some areas where you can find them. Occasionally, they'll be recorded in the deed book. You know, it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. They're very few and in between there. Some of the other books that some of this information as far as the death record is concerned, some of the will books is going to tell that when they were probated, they'll tell that this person died at such and such time, or give you a good idea of when they died. One of the projects we're working on right now with the voters cards, which that's jumping forward in time quite a bit, probably up until about the 1950s or so. Some of that information that was in the voters cards will also tell when that person died, and that way you'll have an idea as far as when they died. That's a project that's ongoing with the archives. We're in the process of doing Logan County and McDowell County. And I think Webster County is already pretty close to we've scanned a lot of. That's another resource that the genealogist can use as far as getting an idea on the death record part of it. And now we'll go to the death certificate. Like I said, practically all the counties still have this going on, and they're all practically the same. Okay, going back to his death certificate. Okay, this is one of the beginning examples, pretty much of the death certificate. They pretty much stayed the same throughout this time period. They're actually there was actually kind of two forms on this. The death certificate was a Division of Vital Statistics Form 2, and then the form that the embalmer used to transport the corpse was the Form 2.0 on this. About 1917, they went to this style of record for state record keeping. That way Charleston would have a record as far as the deaths occurring throughout the state. The state began issuing in 1917. Form was usually filled out by a county registrar. Okay, one thing about these records, like you'll notice on Sid's here, down at the bottom, you have a registrar. Not all of them are signed by the registrar of that county. Sometimes, depending on who filled them out, sometimes the family would fill them out. They would give them to the county clerk. Sometimes the attending doctor would fill them out, hand them to the clerk. They're not always a record that was signed by like the registrar, or which there's actually three parts of it, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But they varied a lot from county to county. Some counties didn't fill out all of it. Some of them would, the personal information, some of that would not be filled out. Some of the doctor's information would not be filled out. Just depended on what that county, I guess, considered important at the time, and how well they were filling them out at the time. How well the doctor was with his information and things. The original was sent to to the West Virginia Department of Vital Statistics, and we have that collection upstairs now. And that collection has been entered online. We have up to 51 years. The past 51 years are not online, which we actually, the death records themselves, the death certificates themselves, we have them up till 1973, and those are on microfilm. Eventually we'll have them all online, but the way the agreement with the state on actually giving out this information and things, it's every year a new group of names are put online onto our website, and so it's going to take a little while until we get it all up till 1973, and then after that, the Department of Vital Statistics still has those, which of course these are not copies that you would be able to take, like to Social Security or something like that, because they're not a stamped copy as far as an official copy goes. If you'll notice on Sid's death certificate here, a lot of the personal information was filled out, and that was probably his wife, Jessie. And of course, not all the information is correct that we've been able to tell, as far as from some of the other census records and things like that. So that's one thing to take into account on some of these death certificates that are really old, is that not all the information may be correct on their family. That's part of that researching that we do, and that I'm sure at the moment they tried to make sure it's as complete as possible. But, that is one thing to take into account on that. As I scroll over to the other side here, this is the medical certificate part of it that Dr. Kemper filled out. And he described what he saw as far as the wounds and things like that. The thing on these death certificates is, as far as diagnosis and things like that, the words that we use nowadays for different, like cancers and things like that, or some of the sicknesses and things that they may have come across that the doctors was trying to describe, may not be what we would consider like, especially with cancer and things. Some of the diagnoses that they had, were not based on x-rays or MRIs or anything like that. But sometimes they were just kind of making a guess on that. So you have to take into account some of that as far as the diagnosis goes. And get down to the corner here. The gentleman that signed this part of the death certificate was J.W. Luthor. He was the undertaker down in Welch. Actually, is one of the undertakers. There was several down in McDowell County, and he was one of the first ones there in McDowell County. I do have some examples of these two forms up here, and after I'm done here, we'll be able to take a look at it. And, sure.
Is this place of burial or removal? What is removal?
Okay, where they sent the corpse to? I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, the place of burial or removal. Yeah, that's where they took the corpse to, or where they were buried at. The thing about Sid here is he was not actually buried in Maywan. He was buried over in Kentucky, over in Brushcook, Kentucky. So that's another one of the things that when we're going through these records that, they're not always 100% correct on. They were the best information probably that Mr. Luthor had at the time, but they're not always 100% correct. So that.
This is 1921. Is that
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, this is a couple years after they started using this particular form here.
How long does the undertaker have to keep records?
The undertaker, from everything I've been able to tell on the death certificates and things, they didn't always keep a copy of the death certificate. What they would usually do is they would try to get one for the family, in case they were wanting something for later on, probably as far as to pay bills or whatever, or prove the death of that person or something like that. Usually the county kept one of these forms. They kept a copy of it. The original came to the state, and then sometimes the undertaker would have a copy of it. The Ball funeral home records that we have, the loose information, some of those were actually death certificates that the Ball funeral home had kept. They're kind of death certificates. Sometimes they kept them. Most of the funeral home stuff was the financial part of it. They didn't really keep a whole lot of the death certificate part of it. Yeah, there is some other records which I'd like to direct your attention to in our library, and that's all the books that we have as far as the cemeteries and obituaries and things like that. We have a lot of those. Sure.
I'm sorry, I was just curious to know how many people know who this man is.
Well.
I'm curious if they know who you're talking about and what his significance was.
Okay, Sid Hatfield. Actually, there's a really good story behind this. Sid Hatfield, he was the constable there in Maitland, West Virginia, and the Baldwin Phelps agents that came there to put the striking miners out. There was a big shootout, and several of the Baldwin Phelps agents was killed. And it's interesting to note that there is no death certificates or death entries for the Baldwin Phelps agents and the ones that was killed. Now there was for the mayor, Cabell Testerman, there was a death certificate filled out for him, and actually it was J.W. Luthor was the undertaker on that also. But that was one of the things that there wasn't always a death certificate filled out. One of my father's uncles, there was no death certificate filled out for him in 1935. He was only 17 years old, and there was really not a whole lot of. He was not married. There was not really a whole lot of information to put on something like that. And at that time, there was not really a big push for people to record these things. Quite possibly a lot of them just didn't want it recorded. They were done, and they just didn't want the information put out there. Joe said the Maywan massacre, or the Maywan shootout, May 19th, and then later on, August 1st of 1921, he's killed up in McDowell County there at Welch. And that's the death certificate for him. But as I mentioned, and I do have several of the books from our collection here. These are cemetery books and things that are of different counties. Practically every county has a historical society or a genealogical society, and a lot of them do these books. And a lot of them are based upon these two records, the county death record and the death certificate that the state has. They take this information and things, and a lot of it is annotated information. The genealogical portion of it, they have these books, which Wayne County has done 4 of them. Clay County has done several. And a lot of this information is based on these two records. A lot of it comes from the obituaries, and a lot of that information is annotated, and it helps the genealogists whenever they see a lot of the genealogical information that the societies have put in that. Some of the books are death record type books. Of course, we have the death certificate is another collection that we have in microfilm thing. And we also have the newspapers. A lot of the newspapers of the state, the early newspapers, a lot of those are on microfilm back in our microfilm storage room. And they have a lot of those obituaries and things, and that's another resource of a death record for a lot of these people that might not otherwise never have some kind of something out there for them.
Okay, I have a question.
Mhm.
If this were my great-grandfather, you're about the right now. Okay, and I found this, and I was trying to find out, go to the cemetery and put flowers on the grave. This would have been no help, right?
You know, and-
So where would I go next?
Yeah, on the cemetery part of it, there is some online things that people have been doing as far as like find the grave and things like that. This is going to, like, this particular one here is going to get you pretty close in the, you know where he's from originally. And some of his family still lived around there, some of them might have, and of course the obituaries in the newspaper, because he would have done a little bit different case for somebody that is just an ordinary person, but it'll get you close to the area in many cases, but not always. That's really not a good answer on that, but
Well, you know, I'm just thinking, so many times as you go back, if I have a Civil War great-grandfather, I can't find a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, a death certificate. All I can find is something that shows that he fought on the side of the Confederates and that he received a pension. That's all I can find.
sometimes that's really a tough situation, because 1917 going on, you're going to have death certificates that's going to get you into the ballpark on it. The county record is, as far as where they were buried at, the county record is not going to be very helpful at all, other than it's going to tell you that most likely they were buried in that county, because their death record is in that county. But that's the unfortunate thing about, you know, a lot of these small cemeteries and things, and that's been the good thing about all these cemetery books. The bad part about it is West Virginia is really tough as far as the mountains and things goes, you know, to get to these cemeteries and things, and a lot of them just disappear. But a lot of people in the counties have, thank goodness, have recorded a lot of where these cemeteries are, and it gives you an idea as far as the genealogical part of it.
If it were, say, a family cemetery in the middle of what's now a cornfield with a little fence around it.
Sometimes you run into that brick wall. That's the genealogy brick wall there. That's where deed books and things like that, as far as the research portion of it, going back into the deed books of, you know, if that family kept the cemetery and actually said something about this, which that information is in the deed books occasionally, as far as sometimes there'll be a telling about a cemetery that was deeded off an eighth of an acre more or less and such field or something, and sometimes they'll have people listed in there. I have seen that. It's one of them kind of falls back into that needle in the haystack problem, where, you know, that information might be out there, but where it is out there is going to be a tough one. The next collection that I'd like to talk about is the Department of Mines fatal accident records. And as I was thinking about how the death records and things, a lot of these records build upon each other. Like the county record, when you start out in your research, you can look at the county record and see a little bit of information, and the death certificate may give you a little bit more information. And then other records, especially records that are here, they were killed in a mining accident or something like that, there's going to be a little bit more information on that person. And then maybe the funeral home record would be even a little bit more to build a more complete picture of that person that you're doing the research on. But the mining records, just in general, they give you a description of the accident. If this person was killed, like say in a slate fall or crushed by a piece of machinery or something like that. Gives an idea as far as the accident, the location of the accident in the mine. It will say, X amount of feet back into the hillside, and it gives you the mining terms for that, how many blocks back into the mine and things. And sometimes, like I said, they would give personal information. I think the sheet that I have up here gives a little bit as far as number of children, when they died, their ethnicity, marriage. It gives a little bit more about that person. If they got some kind of insurance for it, tells a little bit about them. Sometimes it'll tell, was this person what was their habits? Were their habits good? Or was their habits bad? And it tells a little bit more about that. Sometimes that's not good information, but it does give you a little bit about that person. Many of these records were filled out by the mine foreman or the mine supervisor of that particular mine, depending on how far back it is in the teens. It's probably going to be the mine foreman. Usually they'll have a little blurb about the coroner will say something about, I examined this person and they died of X injuries or whatever. The dates in this particular collection, 1919 to about 1932. There's some years that we don't have, and then there's another collection that begins in 1933 and carries up to about 1985, I believe it is. These are very similar records. This other collection that tells a little bit about that person. Pretty much the same information there as far as some of the particulars about their death and things. They kept pretty good records as far as the mines went. The companies kept pretty good records because a lot of times they were having to pay out money to the families and things like that. So they tried to keep, at least gives you enough of an idea of what happened to that person. The next collection I'd like to talk about is the cancer registry. We got this was published by the State of West Virginia Department of Health, and it's just a little thing as far as, it was just for several years. It wasn't a very long list. From 1956 to 1958 and 1963 from January to March. And these are names of people that their diagnosis when they died was cancer of some sort. And usually it'll tell where they died at and where they were from and the date, and gives a little bit of information on that. The type of cancer and things, that's more of a statistical, to me it seems like it's more of a statistical type of information, but it does have some of the dates, and the person would be able to use that in their research and get a little bit more information as far as wherever they were researching.
Do you have any idea why they would have stopped that? I'm thinking that if you had a group of people who all died of breast cancer in Jackson County, West Virginia, where I'm from, in a certain year, then that might be helpful to pinpoint it was because of something in the air or whatever. So it seems like to me that would be something you would want to know. Maybe they didn't, companies didn't want to know, maybe politicians didn't want to know.
No, I wouldn't quite think that. This particular collection that we got, Deborah,
To be honest,
do you have
I
any
can't
further
remember particulars of
information?
the collection, but I think that the Department of Health does, on a statistical basis, still track, X number of cancer deaths, and I'm not so sure it isn't broken down by county, but this actually broke it down by name. I think you can still go back and find those general numbers to see the patterns of the flu deaths or whatever. This actually got to an individual by individual basis. And I suspect it was probably some sort of a research type project probably a grant-funded project, and that may be why it stopped, that the money ran out, researcher moved on to a different project, whatever. But it's just one of those kind of quirky little things that came into us, and we said, well, this would be a good thing, because at some point, it's gonna help somebody out with their research.
Hi, I'm a pharmacist, worked in hospitals, and whenever someone has a cancer diagnosis, they're brought before the tumor board, and then ultimately there's someone there who submits that person to a tumor registry. And I'm wondering, because bringing this up makes me think, well, could the two be related? I don't know where it goes beyond.
I don't know either. It's a good, I'm sure it comes back somehow to the Department of Health, the State Department of Health, and probably goes to vital registration statistics from the death standpoint. And I knew they do track causes of death. But this just happened to be one of those odd little things that got it down to an individual level, and something we just hadn't seen before.
Yeah, this was just a little something that was a little on the oddity side. The one thing as far as names and things on any types of records nowadays is you're going to run into the HIPAA. And, as far as the restriction on their name and things like that, there is going to be restrictions on that. And what that bodes for future historians researching things like this. Will that information be restricted whenever somebody 100 years from now? That kind of, I question that in my mind.
What about people that died in mental institutions? I know a long time ago when you had someone that maybe wasn't mental, but they couldn't talk or couldn't hear or something, they sent them away somewhere. Are there any kind of records that you can access that says so-and-so? Because I have a couple back in my family that supposedly died at Spencer or down to
Up at Weston.
that place down down at Point Pleasant.
Those particular records, the mental hygiene records, or what we call the mental hygiene records now, and that comes through circuit court. And back then they were called lunacy records, and those records are restricted records. They're not something that you'd be able to access, because they are considered, and they're still, when you go to the circuit clerk's office to do research and things, most likely you're not going to be able to look at those records unless you're a family member or something like that. The mental hygiene records for later days, you're not going to have access to those.
Well, who would have access to them?
Family members.
Just the family members?
Most likely the family members or the legal representatives of that family or something like that. Now, a lot of those records, occasionally I will see them whenever I was out into the courthouses quite a bit. You'd see those records in the county clerk's office, and they were not supposed to be in the county clerk's office. They were actually supposed to be in the circuit clerk's office because they are confidential records.
When I was a student at WVU, I did an internship at one in Weston, can't remember what it's called, but anyway, they had log books when people were, because that's a very old one over there. I don't know if that would happen in the 1800s, but they had log books, and they would have entries like why they came in, and they would say, hitchhiking through Rio County, that was their diagnosis. Some of them were kind of interesting. But I would imagine that somewhere, even though that's just long gone, I would imagine that Sharp Hospital replaced that now.
I know Kentucky, they have restrictions even going back into the 1920s and things. When I requested some records on a gentleman that had died in the hospital outside Frankfurt, since I was a family member, they would give me the records.
We have some Spencer hospital records here. Now, the Department of Health's position to me has always been that they are not public records. We can't bring them down, make copies and things. I know what you're talking about with the logbooks. I will go up and look and see if it gives us any dates, if it indicates to us whether they died at the hospital, so you can have the dates and things. I mean, I'll go up and do the abstracting of that for you. I have them for Spencer. If Weston, if they're not still at the new Sharp Hospital, they've got them in storage someplace. A lot of the Department of Health records used to be stored over at the old facility at Lakin. And I don't know whether they're still warehousing that stuff at Lakin or not, but you know, we can get you phone numbers to try and help you get in touch with those. But Spencer would be the only hospital we could probably help on. The one exception being, I think we have a partial list of some of the male patients who were buried at Weston. Only males, I don't know why, but some of them that were buried in the cemetery. We ended up with a partial listing of that, but it's far from complete, I'm sure.
You're right, you should put deaf people in, and you don't put women, and deaf people, or blind people.
They weren't necessarily, you know, somebody that was insane or anything like that. It was,
And you all also find them in the census. I mean, they got listed just like everybody else. And so if you start looking into the 20th century census records, if you look in Lewis County or you look in Roane County, you know, you will find, and they will list out, you know, the staff versus the patients sometimes. So that would be another alternative to look at. At least it would put them in that place at that particular time.
just like the TB sanatoriums and things like that would, for some listings in those counties of those people when they did die. Again, a lot of these things are needle in a haystack kind of things. It takes, it takes a little bit of research to actually get to those sources. Any other questions?
Well, when you say a family member, it doesn't take very many generations to tell you have many family members. And I wonder how extensive you have to prove who you are.
There in Kentucky, when I requested the information on the guy that had died, which he wasn't insane or anything. He was an old man and had developed dementia, and 85 years old. And when I told them that I was his grandson, and this is my name, this a little bit about my lineage and things like that. Since it was from 1924, they released that information to me. Now, if somebody that was closer, like say in 1985 or something, it would have took a little bit more. I would have had a lot more information to provide them, and probably be through court order or something like that for it to be released. They've gotten really, especially with the mental hygiene and things like that, they've gotten really strict on that in recent years.
Did they keep track of epidemics, like, sometimes I know it was in Putnam County that died, but, I don't know what was the Spanish influenza, did they keep?
One of the things, like with Huntington newspapers and things, sometimes they would keep track as far as, and you would be able to keep track of that through a lot of the obituaries and things like that, and through a lot of these death certificates. If you punch in 1918, 1919, 1920, you're going to see that flu epidemic and some of the devastation that it wrought as far as how many deaths and things like that. There was quite a few of those death certificates from those years. You'll see the influenza listed on that. But obituaries and newspapers and things like that. The Wayne County newspaper gave so and so died of flu, Spanish flu, or the Huntington paper would also say certain people, especially when they were a little higher.
I was gonna say, I think with that particular thing, I believe there was a requirement, the counties were supposed to send information to the state, but I think they got so overwhelmed when things were really bad that I don't know how much information actually got sent on who was sick and who had died and so forth. And I think you even find that not all deaths were recorded, and so there may not be a death record with some people who died of the flu.
Especially in that time period. Cabell County, you know, you had the clerks of the court were getting the flu and things like that. And so at that point, it was really spotty, and probably a lot of people was not wanting to go out if they could possibly keep from it. Now, the death certificates and things do, as far as especially in those years, that it's pretty noticeable throughout the death certificates and those. And that's been one thing as far as the books goes from these counties. They will also, a lot of them will have a little blurb about such family was practically wiped out and flew epidemic, and there's a lot of that information. Newspapers and things, they comment on that quite a bit. Yeah, question. I'd like to go into some of the funeral home books, and as I mentioned before, as you get further into these resources and things, they do give you a little bit more information, and these funeral books are the same way with that information. They'll give you a little bit more. That person had died of a certain disease or anything. Most times it'll list that. The military service and things like that, a lot of them will list that type of thing also. Who was paying for the funerals? The Ball Funeral Home, which is these books here. Once we get done, we can take a look at all these books and things. But the Ball Funeral Home was a funeral home that was down in Williamson, West Virginia. It was started by a fellow by the name of M.T. Ball, Marion Ball. His family kept the funeral home going to about 1991, and his father was actually one of the undertakers there in Mingo County, and he was actually the undertaker that took care of the Embalmed List agents. He was the coroner. Not so I don't confuse everybody here. There was two M.T. Balls. The first one was the coroner of Mingo County, and he was the one that took care of the Baldwin Phelps agents, had them sent back over to Virginia, and where they were from originally. And he was also the coroner, and he was also the one that didn't fill out the death certificate for him either. But he was the undertaker there in Williamson for quite a while, and then his son became an undertaker or an embalmer or mortician, and he had the Ball Funeral Home there in Williamson. A lot of the records that we have, unfortunately, we don't have the years that covers the Mayville Massacre. We don't, unfortunately, that book didn't survive. We do have from 1922 up to 1992 of this funeral home, and it covers quite a wide area. There's a lot of people from Kentucky that came through the Ball Funeral Home for funeral services and things, and then down in Mingo County, a lot of Mingo County people, and a lot of the southern Wayne County people, and a few from Logan County and things. Now they covered quite a wide area, which there was other funeral homes in Williamson also. Weaver Funeral Home being another large funeral home there. Which a lot of these later funeral homes were guys that were trained, or actually there was women also, because somebody to take care of the female population that died. A lot of these guys that were later on were trained by Mr. Ball and some of the other funeral. One of the other ones that I'll talk about is this gentleman here, the Luthor Funeral Home. He trained a lot of these guys also, and it was kind of one of them. Well, the training for embalmers, a lot of times they had to serve a 1-year apprentice, and later on that was increased to 2 years, and once they did their apprenticeship, then they would go to a school of embalming, usually up in Chicago or somewhere up in Pennsylvania, and do their professional training. So you had to have a certificate actually from the school of embalming. But the Ball Funeral Home here, there's about 15 volumes of this particular funeral home that we have. It covers a pretty wide area. They were pretty busy. And of course, we also have the Barlow Bonsell funeral home records from here in Charleston. And one of the interesting things about the Barlow funeral home records is it also has listings of where the people bought furniture and things. Because a lot of these funeral homes in the early days, they doubled as a furniture. They would sell furniture. Some of them actually probably had furniture made and things. And usually their sideline was embalming. And that would be part of their business would be to provide that type of care. The Luthor Funeral Home was actually the Welch Furniture and Embalming Company. Dr. Bailey mentioned this in an article that he had written for West Virginia History back in, there's a link to it on our website. And it was one of the articles he wrote. So I'll have these sources for you if you're interested in them. But he goes over some of the early history of some of these of the embalming industry here in West Virginia. And the article that he wrote on that was Alive to the Work, West Virginia State Board of Embalmers, 1899 to 1933. Of course, with Board of Embalmers and things, that always, to me, kind of denotes a little bit of politics and things. And that's the thing about a lot of these early embalmers, is some of them were involved. J.W. Luthor was involved in politics quite a bit. He was a delegate from McDowell County and later on was a state senator for that district down in McDowell County. So they were, most of these early embalmers were very politically connected and things. And they also were very socially connected. You know, the Benny Keatum, a lot of the Masonic lodges and things like that. These men were really involved with a lot of these social groups, and so that helped their business, of course, and plus it kept their businesses as far as the another funeral home that we.
Did this group have any authority to make funeral directors keep records and get those records to the state?
The Board of Embalmers are there's been a Board of Embalmers pretty much throughout, and a lot of it was as far as enforcing, not necessarily who could be an embalmer, but some of the restrictions on, you know, not just anybody could step up and say, hey, you know, drill machine, go out here and have all these coffins. And you know, it was a way for them to enforce, as far as some of the people that were doing it, to have some sort of training. You know, they had to have a certain amount of training and things, and that was part of that board's responsibility, was to ensure that these men were trained and were not just, you know, somebody that just walked in off the street to do business. But they did have a lot of restrictions as far as training and things like that goes. And you know, they had to pay fees and things for their license. They had to be licensed and things, and they didn't in particular have authority, but they could appeal to county prosecutors and things if somebody was doing business that shouldn't be, then they would, you know, appeal to the state authorities and county authorities.
They evidently didn't have any real rules on the record keeping, what happened to the record.
No, as far as what information the funeral home had to keep and things like that.
Yeah.
No, not that. They were more toward toward the sanitation and things like that, what the undertakers and them had to do to. But that's the unfortunate part of it is there wasn't any standardized other than the state had these death certificates, but as we can tell, they weren't always filled out correctly. The other funeral home that we have some of the records from is the Preston Funeral Home. That was another funeral home that was here in Charleston. Talk a little bit about the Board of Embalmers or the Board of Funeral Homes or the Board of Funeral Service Examiners. They went under several different names. A lot of these boards, they were very similar. The Board of Embalmers, they were really the same thing. They were the same membership going throughout all these, and that's one of the collections that we have. And I've got two of the files from that collection. Of course, they had after 1933, there was some changes in the law and things, and Dr. Bailey talks about in his article prior to 1933, he talks about some of the things that they had to do and some of the restrictions and some of the political things that was going on. And then later on, when the state changed the law about 1933, there was some changes in those boards. And we have some of the records of these guys and some of the, where they paid their fees and things like that. And also when they set up the Board of Examiners, and that was where anybody coming into the job of embalmer, they went through this apprenticeship, a year to 2 years, depending on what the time period was. And they had to submit letters of recommendation and things from various embalmers and things. And some of the things that they had to submit was they had to submit a list of people that they had actually embalmed. And usually it's about 35 people. And it would give their names and where they were from and a date of their death and things. And that's going back to another resource, which is kind of an uncomfortable resource, but it is a resource as far as who took care of this person and a little bit more about this person that had passed away and where they were actually taken care of. The Board of Embalmers, it's a pretty good sized collection, about 24 boxes. A lot of it is alphabetical as far as these funeral directors and the embalmers, but it does give you an idea of if you're looking for some of the information that some of these embalmers might have had as far as, of course, the Ball Funeral Home. Some of their collection is also talking about some of the families as far as the family records with payments and things like that. And it's a really interesting collection. Hopefully, one of the things that is a possible database that we can put online that will have these embalmers in it and will tell a little bit about them. Not really tell a little bit about them, but let you know that we actually have their record here. And usually they have a picture of the guy and things like that. Any questions on that? There's a pretty wide amount of embalmers that has come through the state. The two of them that I was going to talk about. The first one, of course, we saw in Sid Hatfield's death certificate, J.W. Luthor, the undertaker that took this, actually Marion Ball. And that is the funeral home director and embalmer that we have these books for. And as I mentioned, he was the son of the coroner of Mingo County that had taken care of Sid Hatfield. And later on, Marion Ball Jr., the guy that actually these books come from, was actually coroner of Mingo County also, and later on in years. And of course, he was connected as far as a lot of the social organizations, the Benny Keaton, a lot of the Masons and all those. So they were quite busy with the social part of it. That is pretty much all I have. Is there any questions on?
Usually you change if, like at Weston or at Spencer, like if they had a cemetery on the hospital grounds.
Well, where the hospital was up in Spencer, there is now a big Walmart. It's that.
The rest of that
They have a cemetery at Weston.
they didn't always encourage people to do that.
Yeah.
They donated a lot of bodies to the services.
You mentioned about the Department of Mines keeping records. I wondered if any other group, like timbering companies or voting people, kept records.
Some of the timber companies, some of them did keep some records, and usually it's in the form of financial records where they would have to pay out an insurance policy, or they would buy a coffin and funeral goods and things like that for one of the workers that had died. There is some of that is out there. Cass, I don't remember on some of the records that I've seen of Cass, but I'm quite sure that they would probably have records of when they bought. They may not mention the name of the person, but if you had a date for the person that died, and you'd have an idea as far as that and a little bit of information that goes along.
Did I understand you say that Luthor was an embalmer for a while at Hatfield?
Yeah. Yeah, he was.
Did you have years on that or about him?
Yes, I do. About 19. About 1998, and for about 6 years.
You were talking about how the Walmart's work on Swiss Hospital. Wouldn't they have had to relocate those burial sites? I mean, if they found somebody, wouldn't they have to move them somewhere?
I would,
Build on top of them.
yeah, I would assume that they probably do.
It's Walmart.
The example I can give as far as that information from the Kentucky prison hospital that I've gotten, that cemetery there, they taped over it. That was over in Frankfurt. So, whether they moved the bodies or found other cemeteries.
Whether they identified them or mass grave them or what.
Over in Kentucky there, what they had done was they hadn't even marked the graves. They buried them. They didn't tell what the plot number was or anything like that. So.
That's not like the ones that, a lot of the people that helped dig that tunnel, the memorial tunnel. Didn't have any idea who the people were that died on that.
Yeah.
And
The
what's next time?
the hospital over in Kentucky was or the prison is a prison hospital, and it had been there since 1856 or so. And it's still there. There's still and they don't bury anybody there anymore. But all through those years, a lot of these people were not. Their family members were long gone, especially if they were old, and a lot of them were unclaimed. Their remains were unclaimed and things, and so they didn't really have anything to do with them. But put them in a grave.
You know, what's frustrating too, is like you showed Sydney Hatfield, that it said the information was supplied by Mrs. Sydney Hatfield. There, you know, it's hard to find a maiden name, you know, their name before they became Mrs. Sydney Hatfield.
That particular death certificate, if you look at it closely, there was actually probably about 3 people that filled out information on it. So probably Jessie filled out some, which, of course, she was a testerman before she was Hatfield.
But you wouldn't know any of that.
Mhm. That's where your census records and all your other records to fill in. This is basically you're just putting in the pieces of the puzzle, and this is just another piece of the puzzle that you can put into that.
What I was gonna say was, even in the last 40 years, a lot of the coal companies have, put massive, I mean, this is true. I'm from Cabot Bricks, and I know this is true, but, some of the, just when you're shoveling out huge, moving the earth that much, some of those cemeteries are just putting them off.
Especially when you get up above the Dakota and up in those areas,
Linwood up there, that, the whole town, all the towns are gone. Towns with a doctor's office and everything, you would never recognize it as ever a town.
you get up where carbon fuel was, and then we go up the left-hand side there, going up above Dakota and things. There's a lot of cemeteries. One of the daughters of one of the shooters from the Hatfield McCoy feud, she's actually buried up there, and her graveside is somewhere up in there. I'm not sure exactly which cemetery, but look, there's cemeteries scattered throughout these hills, and we all know that out there. They're scattered throughout, and that's I keep mentioning the county books as far as a lot of these are documented, thank goodness, by some of these historical societies and things.
I thought there was a program where the counties went to the historical societies and genealogical societies and asked them to go out and record all the locations of the cemeteries that they knew. I know that happened here in Kanawha County and also in Greenbrier County, so I assume that most counties picked that up and did that.
There's probably been several efforts. The WPA was another that went around and did a lot of that type, and that particular collection is also one that we have here, the WPA, where a lot of these records were transcribed and things like that. So that there's been a lot of efforts on a lot of different fronts, the county front, historical societies, individuals and things too, actually document a lot of those on the resting places. Yeah. I would like to mention that our website, a lot of these death certificates and things like that, and we're continually adding to those, and also the links to some of the articles, like I mentioned, Dr. Bailey's article, if you have an interest in the embalming, and that he has an article that there is a link to. Of course, a lot of the books and things we have here, and a lot of the obituaries, a lot of the newspapers, it's really tough on a lot of the obituaries and things like that to have a place that's central for that, and that is one thing that we do offer here is a place with all these newspapers and the obituaries and things. Get a lot of the genealogical information and a lot of where they're buried, that type of information also.
Do you have any information on the cemeteries down in Point Pleasant that they supposedly moved when they put that TNT plant down there back in the, whenever?
That one in particular, I'm not really sure. I know, just to give you an idea of what I would think would have happened on something like that. A lot of times when they put these lakes in and things, they would move the graves and things to different locations and things like that. Now, as far as us having that kind of information, I'm really not sure about that particular one, but I know a lot of the genealogical societies, a lot of times when these graveyards were moved, they would have information included, Wayne County being one, East Lynn, when they put East Lynn Lake in, they moved that cemetery and they did record a lot of those graves. So maybe the Genealogical Society there in Mason County may.
One other thing, a lot of times when they've built the highways and the interstates and things, and they've disrupted some of these little local graveyards, highways right-of-way division has some records on that, and they can help sometimes. If they've actually had to go in and move part of a cemetery or a small cemetery in order to put the interstate through, they made efforts to try and contact the family to see what they wanted to do, and then eventually they would be reburied, and so that would be another source for those types, at least, of disruption of the cemeteries.
Unfortunately, when the railroads came through, a lot of those grave sites and things were not recorded. And things, the N&W, when they came up through the Tug Valley there, a lot of those cemeteries were not, which a lot of them were unmarked and things like that. And the families were not able to buy the tombstones and things like that.
I have one more question, and it doesn't have anything to do with death, but I think about this every time I drive on 77. Oh, especially a house just above Ravenswood that's sitting there, where they had to leave it because of 77. Does anyone know where the records would be that you could find out who lived there in that house? And I wonder what happens to these people, I'm sure they just didn't wither up, but they get moved out of their homes, and I wonder what happened to them.
A lot of, when they're buying right-of-ways and things like that, a lot of those are going to be a deed type record. And especially a lot of the DOT projects and things like that, as far as when they buy out, buy homes and things like that, they do keep records of those, DOT and things does. I'd encourage you to look at anything you want to look at up here. Some of on the embalmers here, I have some pictures of JW and Mr. Ball there, and of course, there's some other information if you want to take a look at it.
We'll see you next month.
Any of the information that I went over tonight, I left my card here. If you drop me an email, I can email you copies of things that I talked about, some of the notes, especially on Sid Hatfield's. I will email you that.
Okay.